In all the analysis of this life, and even in analyzing politics, in fact, especially in analyzing politics, never forget that everything is connected until proven otherwise. There is a lot happening in the motherland. Jubaland forces in Mandera. And then the CBD has suddenly become a very insecure place. It would seem that small gangs have started roaming all over the place. Those two are connected. Welcome to my very revealing show today, where we'll tackle head on what is happening in the country. But you need patience. This is a show where you'll need to put on your thinking caps. Don't worry, I'll make it as interesting as possible. But the issues we're dealing with today in this video are very weighty, grave issues about our country. Things that we should really pay attention to, especially because of where we have reached on that bridge. You remember the bridge I described before the 2022 presidential and general elections? I'm sure most regulars remember. Especially because of the deadly, precarious place we have reached. In this very shaky wooden bridge, with a few pieces of wood here and there missing, which really means one wrong step and you understand. Fellow Kenyans, we really need to care because we don't have any other country. And all this is all for a better Kenya. And I remain yours truly, Karaoke Kumekucha. Oh yes, until that day, those dear brothers and sisters of ours get out of the terrible situation they are in right now. Karibuni sana na twende kazi. How is it possible that the presence of Jubaland troops in Mandera and the insecurity in Nairobi CBD are connected? How is that even possible? Okay, please allow me to tell you this story right from the beginning, step by step, and we're going to totally understand Mosmos. Okay? Asanteni sana for allowing me to do that. Now, while analyzing 2027 politics, there is that group of very wise Kenyans with experience on Kenyan politics who are refusing to be drawn into the debate. Why? Because it is irrelevant, since the election is going to be rigged. So if an election is going to be rigged, this analysis ni ya nini? Because according to them, it's very predictable. In 2027, the elections are going to be rigged in favor of the William Ruto regime. They will be back in power, mtadu, and that will be the end of it. That is their position, and I respect it. However, the reality is, it is not possible, taking all things into account, because rigging elections is a science. Taking all things into account, it is impossible, the way things are in Kenya today, for anybody to rig an election in favor of the Ruto regime. And I'm going to explain in detail why. But before I do that, let me make it clear, this is not good news. Because other means will be used to keep the Ruto regime in power. And that is really the bad news. objectives. Okay? And I will come to those means, in quotes, shortly. Naturally, to understand why it is impossible to rig this election in 2027, we first of all have to deeply understand how an election is rigged. Don't worry, I'm going to keep it very simple, super simple. Okay? And I want to start with the following statement, which I'm sure will take most of us aback. Okay? The way in which presidential elections have been rigged has not changed since the very first presidential election to be rigged in Kenya in 1992. I know we have moved to electronic voting, allegedly. Okay? And in those days it was purely manual in 1992. But please hold your horses. I will quickly explain. The two key components of successfully rigging a presidential elections are perception, very important, and then the careful adding of some votes or a number of votes, or shall we say adequate votes for the desired candidate to win. The adding of votes part, naturally, can either be done electronically or manually. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. Now, let me physically take you to the 1992 presidential elections at two polling stations. Now, in those elections, my political lecturer and I voted in two different polling stations. And we both noticed the same thing. Okay? You know, when you're going to cast your vote, you are supposed to be given your privacy to cast your vote. There should be nobody peering over your shoulder to see what you're doing. But the way those two polling stations were set up was in such a way that somebody could stand at a short distance away, but strategically be able to see very clearly what you're marking on the ballot paper. And in my case, there were two gentlemen very interested in me as I marked my ballot paper. The same with my political lecturer. Now, being the son of a cop, I could immediately tell those were intelligence officers. But I didn't put it all together on the spot. This only happened later when we sat down to analyze the voting with my political lecturer as he continued his political lecture over a fireside as the chilly Iveti Hills wind hit our faces. Oh, those were the days, the good old days. Wow, I really miss them. I really miss them. Anyway, this retired police officer and his son were able to conclude that what was happening is that those intelligence officers, both at his polling station and mine, were there to carefully observe and estimate the number of votes that would be going Moi's way, which of course was very important in neutral areas like Ukambani during those general elections. Of course, the areas which were not neutral were Moi's Kalenjin area and Morema, who had two strong candidates in that election, Stanley Matiba and Mwai Kibaki. Years later, looking very carefully through the polling station results of those elections, it was very easy to see what had been done. For Moi to win those elections, win in quotes. And to understand this, we must take note of the fact that number of polling stations becomes very important when you want to rig an election. Okay? And it is because of the following. Imagine there are 4,000 polling stations in the country. And in each polling station, you add an average of 100 votes. 4,000 multiplied by 100 is 400,000 votes. That's a very big figure. And it is instructive to take note of the fact that Moi beat second placed Matiba in those elections by slightly over 500,000 votes. Okay? By the way, adding an average of 100 votes at every polling station, average means One polling station you had 50, another 150, another 100, and so on. But at the end of the day, the average is 100. Okay? Those are very few votes, very difficult to notice, and it is highly unlikely that what came to happen in later rigged elections, where you find that actually the number of people who voted at a polling station are more than the registered voters, number of registered voters in that polling station. In the days of Moi, it was a carefully rigged, carefully, intricately rigged presidential election. Moi was a careful man. Moi was a man of details. Despite the fact that we are told he did not go to school much. But make no mistake about it, that mzee was smart. Evil and smart. Now, from a legal standpoint, if somebody went to court and contested the election results, where would they start? Because to win any case, you need something called evidence. And this evidence has to very conclusively prove that a certain law was broken. Okay? Now, how do you do that in this case? Very difficult. It is well worth noting the difference in the way Moi rigged elections and the way others rigged elections was that Moi's elections were carefully rigged. The others were carelessly rigged. Because there are a lot of other details which go into successfully rigging a presidential election. Let me give you a few examples of the careless and the careful. Ballot papers arriving late, ballot papers and other election material, arriving late and therefore causing voting to start late at, wait for this one, at the strongholds of the opposition. Note carefully, that never happens at the president's strongholds. I'm sure you realize how serious it is, ballot papers arriving late. Because Kenyans are busy. Somebody has planned his day properly. Most Kenyans have planned their day carefully. They want to go and vote first thing in the morning and then go to the shamba or go to their work. So when ballot papers arrive late, there is a high possibility that Kenyan or those Kenyans, those busy Kenyans, will not cast their vote. Because they have to survive. They have to put food on the table. That is the priority, not voting, as important as it is. Moi was careful to use plausible deniability. For instance, in 1997, we had the El Nino rains. There was an election that year. And of course, Moi used those rains. Ballot papers were late because of the heavy rains. Plausible deniability. What did others do? Ballot papers ending up at the wrong polling station. Hey, that one is difficult to explain. Very difficult. What obviously fishy things did others do? Well, here's a classic one. In 2007, Raila Amolo Odinga was vying for the Langata seat as Member of Parliament under the old constitution. Now, super interesting. At the polling station where Raila Odinga went to cast his vote, and a few others around that area, the voters register covering the letters A and the letters O and the letters R were missing. Now, the names of our Luo brothers and sisters, most of them start with which letters? A and O. And Raila's name starts with R. Careless rigging. By the way, the idea in 2007, somebody came up with the idea of organizing things at Langata so that Raila loses that parliamentary seat. What? You know, there's a difference between carefully thinking something through and carelessly dreaming of something. Very huge difference. Anyway, what happened in that particular case is that the chairman of the then ECK, Electoral Commission of Kenya, which was in charge of elections at that time, the chairman Samuel Kivuti himself came to that polling station to sort out the problem because there was going to be chaos at that polling station, naturally. So the chairman Kivuti himself came and he sorted it out. And Raila and his supporters voted, and Raila won that parliamentary seat. End of story. It was also in 1992 that we first saw in Kenya for the very first time opinion polls on voting patterns. And a few appeared, showing Moi with a slight lead over the opposition leaders. And then the government very successfully sold us the narrative that people in Oshago, upcountry areas, vote very differently from people in urban areas. In other words, people upcountry are not thinking. They are slow. And we bought that narrative hook, line and sinker. And so when the results, the rigged results of the 1992 presidential elections were released, most Kenyans accepted those results as the true results. Yes, the opposition complained, but they couldn't explain to Kenyans exactly how this election was rigged or stolen from them. Especially because the combined votes of the opposition leaders would have been enough to send Moi home. And of course the government then also quickly added the narrative that all the opposition leaders were just greedy for power because they couldn't sit down and agree on one candidate. Therefore they were greedy for power, and therefore Kenyans should just ignore them. It worked like a charm. When the opposition leaders got together to complain, Kenyans ignored them. What's wrong with you people? You'd have won this election and you'd have sent Moi home. In fact, Kenyans grew very angry against the opposition leaders. What? That's how the 1992 presidential elections were successfully rigged. And let me repeat, very little or nothing has changed in the way presidential elections are rigged to date, including the year 2022. I said very little because there is one major difference which I've already mentioned. In 1992, everything was done carefully. Everything was carefully planned. In 2022, that was the most carelessly rigged presidential election. And that is why a vast majority of Kenyans will never accept those results. Okay? So those two components are very important. Perception and then the actual execution of the rigging. Now take very careful note of the fact, without working on perception, then the other component of executing the rigging will fall flat on its face. It will not work. There is no way it can work unless you get your perception across and convince people that this person, actually it is possible for them to win an election. Okay? There are other reasons, but let's focus on that one as the main reason why it is impossible in 2027 for the Ruto regime to rig itself back into power. Because the component of perception is impossible. I think we agree on that. In fact, things are so bad for this regime that if an election were held today and Ruto became second, the runners-up in those elections, there would still be suspicion that he has rigged. Nobody would believe those results. That is how bad it is for them. Therefore, the perception component, kwisha maneno. And therefore it is impossible, very impossible, for the Ruto regime to rig itself into power. Please ignore what all those armchair analysts out there are saying. Okay? Hizo ni stories za jaba. It cannot work. Take it from me. It can't. But let me also include another reason why it is impossible. And I'll take it from the other side. The actual adding of votes. Okay? Now let us assume in the 2027 presidential elections, we have at least 3 or 4 very strong candidates vying for the presidency along the incumbent, President Ruto. Okay? Now, how are you going to take away votes from those candidates? Because you see, this thing works best when you have one candidate who will receive a large amount of votes, and therefore it is easy for you to add votes without anybody noticing. But in this case, when you add votes, and at that polling station you overtake the runners-up at that particular polling station, and at the other one you overtake another runners-up. How will that work? And remember that each of these candidates are carefully monitoring the election results from each and every polling station. How are you going to get away with that? Impossible. Okay? You know, there are people who are saying that it is best for the opposition to get one candidate. That is the easiest way of getting rid of Ruto. I don't agree. And I've given you one reason why I don't agree. And of course, as usual, you don't have to agree with my views. Yeah, you can have a different view. That is okay. That is how this channel works. There is nobody who has a monopoly of knowledge, not even me. I'm ready and willing to learn at any time. I'm a student. I'm not a guru. I'm a student of politics, and I'll always forever remain a student. That is the only way to keep learning at a fast rate. Now, since rigging an election will not work, and this regime must remain in power, what other option do they have on the table? Glad you asked. Let me tell you a brief story. Between 1975 and 1977, in a country called India, the then Prime Minister, a very tough and great lady called Indira Gandhi, declared a state of emergency in the country. Now, when you declare a state of emergency, it means, one of the things it means, is that you cannot have an election. Okay? You cannot have an election. And therefore, Indira Gandhi very cleverly avoided a general election she was going to lose by declaring this state of emergency. Of course, she cited reasons like internal and external threats to the nation. And it was legally within her powers to declare a state of emergency. Let's come back to Kenya. The President of the Republic of Kenya can declare a state of emergency. It is within his powers. Okay? After all, he is best placed with all the information he has and with all the information he receives, which nobody else has. He is best placed to do such a thing. Okay? Now, we have some very disturbing trends, very disturbing developments in our country. Jubaland troops in Mandera. What are they doing there? Okay? I am sure we all realize how vulnerable that makes us as a nation. Yeah, apart from anything else, it makes the nation called Kenya very vulnerable to anything, because we have foreign forces on Kenyan soil. That is very serious. Nothing can be more serious than that. And then meanwhile, we have a problem in the Nairobi CBD. I find it super fascinating that somebody like Albert Ojwang posts something on Twitter, and top, the security boys are there. Pick him up. But then, right in the central business district of Nairobi, funny things are happening. Gangs are walking around, and nothing is being done. And by the way, let us not forget that a large section of the CBD Nairobi is covered by cameras. And therefore, this is a very easy problem to deal with. But then, it appears that there's some lethargy. People are slow. People don't want to move against this thing, which may suggest that this is actually being encouraged. And actually, it is possible it is being instigated by some very powerful people. And the question is, to what end? Okay, just hold on to that question. Okay? In my last video, I covered what is happening in the Rift Valley. Now, God forbid, if problems break out in the Rift Valley, and then you combine that with what is happening in the Nairobi CBD, and then in Mandera things escalate, what do you have in the country? The perfect environment, the perfect excuse, the perfect situation to declare, say it with me, a state of emergency. Yeah. Please allow me to leave it there for now. Okay? And I should add the following. Many times when we're analyzing politics, we stay very busy focused on the wrong things. We stay very busy focused on the things which are not as important as some of the things we are totally ignoring. Okay? And one of the reasons for this is bringing too much emotion into our political analysis. When you bring in emotion, it is easy to miss those things which really matter to all of us. It matters not whether you're from Murima or you're from Elwak or the coast or Tana River. It affects all of us. Even the Rigathi Gachagua Manenos is an issue that can easily escalate out of hand. Very easily. Okay? Now everybody noticed, although most Kenyans were surprised, that despite the threats from Ruto people, Ruto handlers, allies of the president, despite the very strong threats that Rigathi Gachagua should be arrested, the DCI were even directed in public, as soon as this man steps on Kenyan soil, arrest him. Despite the fact that that did not happen. He was not arrested. He is in the country and is a free man. And that really puzzled many analysts. Although not the people who have taken in my latest highly sensitive special report on this matter. But the truth is, the Gachagua issue can also be allowed, I'm choosing my words carefully, can also be allowed to escalate out of hand. Or even better, it can be chokozwad. Something can be done to provoke the supporters of Rigathi Gachagua into doing things which result in a situation where things in the country are out of hand. Oh God Almighty, help Kenya. Remember Kenya. Rescue us from this very deep hole that we are clearly falling into. Amen. Very quickly before I go, I just want to remind you of that very latest highly sensitive special report I've been talking about on Rigathi Gachagua, which explains a lot of things. It may even explain why a state of emergency is the only way out for some people to survive because of Gachagua's current position. Okay? And one very easy way of ensuring that you get each and every highly sensitive special report, not only this one, is to take the opportunity we have, very small window of opportunity, for you to join the very exclusive club of those who hold the golden card or the golden key to everything Kumekucha. So that every time in the future, and I know I'm going to be releasing a lot of these in the next few days and weeks, as soon as a sensitive report comes out, you will never again need to worry about payment. Pop! You get it in your inbox. Now you can see details on your screens right now. This is permanent. It is not annual. You will forever have this golden key. You will never ever need to pay for anything. Okay? Obviously this is very, very valuable. Obviously this is not for everybody. And therefore the rest of us, we can get this Gachagua very hot special report in the usual way. Now you can see details of that on your screens right now. For only Kenya shillings 19.99, you can receive this information that will help you clear a lot of confusion, clear a lot of cloudiness to understand what is really going on in our politics at the moment. Despite the many, many developments here and there, you will be able to understand why it is all linked and what is happening and why we're in a very, very bad situation, a terrible situation as a country today as we speak. Until next time, this is Chris Kumekucha.